Home Alone is undeniably a Christmas classic. How could anyone not love it? It tells the story of a young boy, Kevin McAllister, who's accidentally left behind when his family leaves for a Christmas vacation. To make matters worse, 2 burglars have targeted the McAllister house while Kevin is there by himself. Unfortunately, that's also where things kind of start to break down. Kevin defends his homestead by setting up a series of elaborate and dangerous traps in order to stop the bad guys from robbing the place, instead of, calling the cops. And that's just one of the many dumb things in Home Alone that everyone just ignored. Call the police. What's the first thing that every kid learns to do when they realize they're in danger?
Didn't they teach you that in school about 911, that you call if somebody needs help?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Either Kevin didn't get the memo, or he just doesn't have the mental capacity of a 4-year-old. Sure, the phone lines are down, but he knows how to get into town to go food shopping, and he knows exactly when Harry and Marv will be robbing his house. Kevin only dials 911 near the end of the film, after the crooks have made their way through almost all of his traps. Even weirder, when he finally calls the cops, he disguises his voice and tells them his neighbor's address. Why was that the plan? Did he think the cops would hear a child's voice calling for help on 911 and they wouldn't come? Or maybe it's because the cops in this town suck.
Oh, he's just home alone, and I would like somebody to go over to the house and see that he's all right, just to check on him.
You want us to go to your house just to check on him?
The cops of Home Alone are basically garbage with badges. When they're informed about a small child left without supervision, they send 1 police officer to the McAllister house. The cop knocks on the door and then arbitrarily decides Kevin's mom just can't keep track of her children because no one answers. Maybe that's why the wet bandits don't seem concerned in the slightest when Kevin makes multiple threats to call the police. Harry and Marv simply ignore Kevin and continue to invade his home. They're already guilty of breaking and entering, and they're attempting to assault a minor, so the charges would probably be pretty severe. But because Kevin lives in a town full of Paul-Blarts, there's really no reason for them to worry. Even the pizza boy has lost hope. Home Alone must happen in some dystopian alternate reality where the law simply doesn't matter. When Kevin plays the audio from an old gangster movie to make the pizza guy think he's about to get murdered, there are absolutely no consequences. Apparently, this kid just went back to delivering more pizzas and never warned anyone about the spray of gunfire that just took out half the neighborhood's inflatable Santas. Marv doesn't know how TV works. The pizza boy scene is weird, but Kevin uses the same trick on Marv as he tries to break in the back door. It worked on the especially stupid pizza boy because Kevin only played certain parts of the conversation, making the pizza boy believe that he was talking to a real person. And we all know that pizza boys are dumb.
People said I was dumb, but I proved them.
But when Marv comes to the door, Kevin just plays the movie. Sure, Kevin adds his own special effects, but has Marv never heard of a TV before? How does this work? Why is this happening?
Is this real life?
Uncle Frank is a monster. So we've talked about how the movie Suburban Hellscape is filled with morons, but we can't let Kevin's clan off the hook. The McAllister family is a bunch of hot garbage. While it makes sense that Kevin might get picked on by his older siblings and cousins, why are the adult McAllisters straight up bullying an 8-year-old? When it comes to the steaming pile of awful human trash that is this family, Uncle Frank lives at the top. When Kevin gets into a fight with Buzz, who was pretending to throw up on Kevin, by the way, some soda gets spilled on Uncle Frank's lap. Kevin didn't even do it. It was Kevin's useless dad. So naturally, Uncle Frank loses it.
Look what you did, you little jerk!
Nobody defends Kevin. Not his parents, not even the kid from Pete and Pete.
Kevin, you're such a disease.
Frank is a middle-aged adult with some very deep psychological issues. Forget Harry and Marv, if anyone deserves a nail through the foot, it's Frank. The McAllisters may all be monsters. Kevin's mom has to rush back home because they can't get in touch with anybody to look in on Kevin. But how is that possible? The entire town didn't go away for Christmas. Kevin goes to school and even mentions that he has friends. So why can't his parents call one of their families? Or any of the friends of Kevin's 7,000 siblings? Is there literally no one in the entire state of Illinois that the McAllisters can trust to check up on Kevin? Kevin is gonna kill his family. Remember how Harry and Marv kept falling down the stairs because they were covered with ice? Or how the basement steps were covered in tar and nails? Kevin's massive family was basically walking into a death trap by the end of the movie. Kevin isn't exactly the most conscientious kid, and he's even pretty happy about the possibility that he psychically murdered them.
I made my family disappear.
So it's incredibly unlikely the kid cleaned up after himself. Hopefully Uncle Frank cracks his melon on those icy steps first.
Hey, pizza's here!
There you go. That's $122.50.
Oh, it's my brother's house. He'll take care of it.
Your name's Kevin? You know what they're gonna call you in France, don't you, huh?
No.
Yank!
Ugh, we really hate that guy. In a turn of events that surprised exactly no one, Star Wars The Force Awakens became one of the biggest hits of the past several years, and scored some pretty great reviews to boot. It borrowed heavily from the first Star Wars film, sure, but it sprinkled enough fresh ideas to balance out the nostalgia perfectly. So the film is pretty great. But that doesn't mean there aren't a few things in there that might make you scratch your head. Here are the dumb things we all ignored in Star Wars The Force Awakens. So, what's the First Order's whole deal anyway? In the original Star Wars trilogy, the Rebellion fights for freedom from the tyranny of the Empire. The Empire is, well, an empire. It's a huge evil government that rules the galaxy with an iron fist. Makes sense, right? But in The Force Awakens, it's the Resistance that fights against the First Order. And the First Order is what exactly? If the Rebellion defeated the Empire, and the galaxy is now governed by the New Republic, then what the heck is the First Order? What do they do, and why? And where'd they get the resources to build an entire planet made of Death Stars? Curious fans can hit up Google for the First Order's unexplained backstory. But seriously, we shouldn't have to chase down the answers to some pretty basic questions by digging into the Force Awakens visual dictionary that kids buy at elementary school book fairs. R2-D2's perfect timing. That little data file that led to Luke's hidden location served as a great carrot to dangle in front of everyone and keep this movie, rolling. If there's one thing Star Wars does great, it's hiding important information in adorable robots.
What message? The one you've just been playing. The one you're carrying inside your rusty innards.
But BB-8 only has a piece of the map, so naturally the little guy wonders about the other droid who spent some time as a rolling flash drive, R2-D2. In fact, he asks R2 about whether or not he's got the rest of the map everybody needs. And then this happens.
You're wasting your time. It is very doubtful that R2 would have the rest of the map in his backup data. I am afraid not. R2-D2 has been in low power mode ever since Master Luke went away.
But C-3PO is totally wrong, as we find out at the end of the film when R2 suddenly wakes up just in time to put everybody back into a good mood. That's great timing, R2. But hadn't the Resistance ever tried to look through R2's memory before? He literally has a computer for a brain. Nobody dug out a USB cable and plugged him into the computer. No one in the Resistance has heard of Control-F. Captain Phasma is not very fantastic. Captain Phasma is undeniably cool, what with her shiny armor, fancy cape, and slick British accent, and then she goes down like a sack of potatoes. And then she pretty much caves immediately. Finn tells her to bring down the shields across the base, and she does it without a fight. Did she only get that fancy stormtrooper suit because she's like General Hux' cousin or something? Hunks don't need parachutes. Remember when Finn and Poe crash land on Jakku, and Finn takes Poe's jacket from the smoking wreckage? It sure seemed like Poe was dead until he showed up again for the last act of the movie. We never find out how he survived, or even why he left his style and jacket behind. The reason? Poe was actually dead, at least in the first bunch of drafts of the screenplay. Apparently, director J.J. Abrams was so taken with Oscar Isaac's performance, he decided to keep Poe around after all. Too bad we can't say the same for every pilot in Star Wars, of course.
Cover me, Porkins.
I'm right with you, Red 3. Got a problem here.
Eject!
I can hold it.
Pull up!
No, I'm all right.
Sorry, Porkins. Should have been handsomer. A convenient chasm. The film ends with a climactic battle between Rey and Kylo Ren as she takes the emo Vader wannabe to the woodshed. By the end of the fight, Kylo Ren has a few holes in him and Rey is triumphant. Then, a very convenient hole opens up right between them, allowing Ren to be rescued before the Starkiller base explodes. This, of course, is highly symbolic of the ideological divide between Rey and Kylo Ren. One is embarked on the path of the Jedi, while the other has turned his back on it forever. Good versus evil. Dark versus light. Oh, and keeping your exciting new bad guy alive so he can come back and give your heroes a hard time in the sequel. Too bad we can't say the same for every exciting new bad guy in Star Wars, of course. Sorry, Darth Maul. Should have been, Kylo Renier.
The Hunger Games did a lot of things right, faithfully adapting Suzanne Collins' best-selling books into a blockbuster franchise that launched Jennifer Lawrence into worldwide superstar status. But as good as it was, it didn't quite do everything right. Here's a look at some dumb things everyone ignores about the Hunger Games. Idiocracy. The basic concept of the Hunger Games takes some suspension of disbelief to buy into, but even then, the politics don't really make much sense. Think about this. The folks in the districts do all the hard labor to keep the rich people in the capital flush with food and coal and amazing hair dyes. Considering they need the workers in the districts to keep working, wouldn't it make way more sense to actually, feed them enough to do that work? Plus, given how technologically advanced the capital is, using just a little bit of that know-how to help automate things like coal mining would significantly boost productivity while also raising quality of life and morale in the districts. Acting like a bunch of evil jerks might be fun, but it doesn't make good business sense. Drinking games. When we first met Haymitch, he's pretty much a useless, snarky drunk with no interest in helping Katniss and Peeta figure out how to survive when the fighting begins. Then the next morning, Jerkface is gone and has suddenly been replaced by a helpful, wise mentor who whips the District 12 team into shape. That change happens literally overnight. So maybe all Haymitch needed that whole time was a good breakfast? Coaching fail. Speaking of Haymitch, he's apparently the smartest dude in the entire country, because when the games actually begin, the contestants from every other district act like a bunch of idiots. Haymitch's big piece of advice is to ignore the supplies at the cornucopia and just run for the woods, because it's gonna be a bloodbath as the others fight over the goodies. And it is. It seems obvious, but apparently the mentors in other districts didn't think to pass this nugget of wisdom along to their kids. Because sure enough, a bunch of them get creamed in the first 30 seconds. Maybe their mentors were even drunker than Haymitch? Wait, no, that's impossible. It's well after breakfast by this point. Burn, baby, burn. A pivotal moment in the Hunger Games takes place when Katniss is chased up a tree by a pack of other contestants. After a half-hearted effort to kill her, Peeta convinces them to just make a campfire and wait for her to die of, old age or something. That turns out to be a bad plan, because through a complete stroke of luck, Katniss finds a conveniently placed hive full of genetically modified bees, which she drops on their dumb heads.
I think those are tracker jackers. Am I wrong?
Oh, those things are very lethal.
Very.
But if those kids can make fire, why didn't they just, set fire to the tree? Trees are made of wood, right? Even in the future? And if the flames didn't get her, the smoke probably would have, or at least forced her to jump, which probably would have hurt her pretty bad. Way to go, you dead dum-dums. Cake Wars. Peeta may not be the most useful guy with a weapon, but he sure is one hell of a painter. He shows off his incredible camouflage artistry during training, and again uses it to go incognito after suffering a pretty substantial sword wound to the leg. We're told he picked up this rare and impressive skill by decorating cakes at the District 12 bakery. Really.
I used to decorate the cakes down at the bakery.
So does that mean the US military should be tapping the camouflage skills of Duff Ace of Cakes Goldman? Should Cake Boss be teaching courses to Army cadets at West Point about how to disguise yourself as a giant edible pink rose for combat reasons? Just how the hell does baking and decorating cakes teach a kid how to go full-on Mudman? Listen, Peeta, we're calling shenanigans. The amount of effort and talent it would take to create that spotless camouflage is a whole lot more than you'd pick up by writing, "Happy birthday, here's a coal cake," a few times a week with an icing squirter. Plus, since we're on the subject, how would anyone in District 12, which is entirely made up of starving coal miners, have the cash to get a cake?
When it comes to popcorn movies, the phrase dumb fun might get used by fans, and a lot of people found Suicide Squad to be just that, dumb fun. But was there just a bit too much dumb? With a collection of A-list actors as ridiculous comic bad guys, you'd think it'd be hard to get it wrong, and while the end result has some great moments, the final cut that made it to the silver screen was reportedly wrecked by the studio making cuts. While you may have seen the extended edition at home, here are some dumb things in the theatrical version of Suicide Squad that everyone just ignored. The magic machine. Enchantress exists so the Suicide Squad can go up against the sexy villain with a generic plan.
Please don't touch me. Please don't touch me.
Her big evil idea? Build a mysterious machine to end mankind. And that's pretty much it. The device, apparently powered by Enchantress's sweet dance moves and makeout sessions, is never actually explained. She just says she's going to create a giant garbage tornado to get back at humanity, then it opens up a hole in the sky. Enchantress can transform any human into a member of her jelly army, and her brother has crazy fire whips for arms that can slice through anything. If you can't take over the world with just that, you're doing it wrong, lady. Justice League who? By the time Suicide Squad rolled around, The Flash and Wonder Woman were already introduced to movie audiences. To have them disappear during one of the biggest meta-human crises the world has ever seen doesn't quite add up. It would have been simpler to set the film pre-Man of Steel than to pretend that these heroes didn't exist for the big fight of Suicide Squad. We could accept if Batman called in sick after learning his lesson about not fighting superpowered villains. But no Wonder Woman? She's all about this kind of stuff. The helicopter crash. Suspension of disbelief is pretty critical when viewing any superhero film. But that doesn't mean you have to toss out everything you know about physics and biology in the name of action-packed evil shenanigans.
Evil shenanigans.
When the Suicide Squad's helicopter is shot down as they're entering the city and does about a dozen flips on the ground, you'd expect a broken fingernail at the very least. The super tough Killer Croc might come out okay, but somehow, everyone hops out of the downed copter like they're fresh out of the shower.
What a ride!
We know they're bad guys, but there's no way that someone didn't at least bang a knee in that crash.
Ah! Ah!
We'll say it again. We're calling shenanigans.
You mean shenanigans? Oh!
The only bomb in the universe. The first attempt at blowing up Incubus failed because Enchantress cut out on the team moments before the bad guy destroying bomb went off, with no way to reset the countdown. Instead of setting the bomb for 5 minutes or something, they based an entire plan around an unreliable magical weirdo.
Needless to say, the whole thing was a bad idea.
Even stranger, they only have one of these bombs and somehow can't make another, so they have to retrieve it from a flooded subway system. At the very least, this makes Killer Croc swimming, powers actually relevant, but it's never explained why this one bomb is the only bomb, or why wiping out the building from above isn't an option, or why don't they just use a drone or something? Why must the squad do everything the hard way?
We're bad guys. It's what we do.
Oh, okay then. Terrible admissions policy. Amanda Waller's entire reason for assembling the Suicide Squad was so she could have her own group of super people she could control. But the team leaves a lot to be desired. While it's kinda accurate to the comics, the film doesn't really make the reasons for their roster clear. Villains like Killer Croc, Diablo, and Deadshot make sense to have around because their skills can be pretty handy. But what about Harley Quinn and Captain Boomerang? Harley Quinn has been shown to be a clever tactician in the comics, but all of that's replaced with tight shorts in the film. Last time we checked, hot pants weren't a superpower. Captain Boomerang is a sociopathic bank robber who can throw boomerangs, which are the least effective weapon of all time. While we're on the subject of the Captain, Boomerang returns. After the team has its near breakup toward the middle of the film, the gang decides to get back together and go face off against Enchantress. It's fairly well established why everyone decides to stick around for the big fight, but then Boomerang just randomly jumps in with them as they do their heroic walk off into battle. Unlike most of the other team members, Boomerang never really showed any interest in being a team player. So why does he come back? Is it because he's all into boomerangs and they always come back?
Oh no! It's coming back this way! That throwing stick stun of yours has boomeranged on us!
And where does he keep getting those beers? Maybe that's his real superpower.
Something wrong, Yank?
No. It's pretty big, I guess.
Star Trek Beyond is a fun, fast-paced space romp. But just like any great action movie these days, it still includes more than a few head-scratchers. Here's a look at some dumb things in Star Trek Beyond everyone just ignored. Random chance. Creepy bad guy Krall is looking for an alien artifact that was chucked into space hundreds of years ago. So how convenient is it that Kurt happens to randomly end up with it after a totally unrelated diplomatic mission? It's also handy for Krall that Kurt kept it on board his ship instead of sending it somewhere safe.
Log that and put it in the vault spot, thank you.
Oh, and the fact that he brings it to the closest possible outpost to Krall's base is a pretty lucky break as well. You know, considering the endless vastness of space and all. Dangling plot thread. When everyone takes the escape pods and heads for Krall's planet, Scotty drops out late and navigates his pod down to the surface. When he gets there, he realizes he's landed it on the edge of a very big cliff and finds himself in a classic Fast and Furious style action scene where he has to run up the falling pod and grab hold of a tiny ledge hanging off the cliff. Then we cut away, and the next time we see Scotty, he's safely wandering around the planet at the bottom of the cliff. So how did he get off the cliff? Scotty is known for his big brain, but not for his epic mountain climbing skills. Unless he jury-rigged a jetpack, we'd expect the scene to end with him just falling to his death. Those darn drones. So Krall's whole thing to get this artifact is to create a deadly bioweapon. But since Krall already has a seemingly unstoppable drone army capable of taking out Starfleet's most advanced ships, why not just attack with that? Style points? Plus, we find out those drones are based on some ancient mining tech left on the planet. So how did Krall turn a bunch of mining robots into the universe's most dangerous fleet? Does that mean some jerky supervillain will just be able to weaponize all the drones we have flying around here on Earth?
This amazing innovation then lowers itself slowly to the ground, drops off the package, and flies straight back up to altitude.
Did we just figure out the real reason that Amazon's Jeff Bezos made a cameo in the movie?
Cheers.
Total recrawl. Jayla has conveniently been living in the USS Franklin for years, and has used a fancy bit of cloaking tech to keep the ship hidden from Krall and his minions. But once Krall is revealed to be the long-lost captain of the Franklin, it begs the question, how did he not already know where his ship landed? Space amnesia? A long night of drinking space beers? Yeah, it's probably the space beers. That's usually it. Beastie Bikes.
Let's make some noise.
Okay, so no one's going to dispute that this was probably one of the most fun scenes in the movie. And yes, we love the Beastie Boys too. But even though it's been a running gag since 2009's Star Trek reboot, the fact that the Beastie Boys are still supposedly relevant 3 centuries from now is actually pretty silly. Don't agree? Here's a quick quiz. Name a pop star from the 1760s. While you're Googling that, we also have to ask about the motorcycle that plays a pivotal role in the finale. Why is there an ancient motorcycle on the USS Franklin, and how is it still working after all this time? Between the bike and the Beastie Boys, it seems like director Justin Lin really just wanted to make a cool 80s biker flick instead. Uhura's Spidey Sense. We get a peek at the USS Franklin's old crew footage midway through the film, though Kirk and everyone else turns away before Idris Elba appears in the frame. But Uhura circles back to the footage late in the film, gets a look at the long-lost captain, and immediately deduces that the captain is actually Krall.
It's him.
But how? He doesn't look anything like that anymore. Does she have facial recognition software along with a GPS tracker and that necklace Spock gave her?
Lieutenant Uhura wears a Vokaya amulet, which I presented to her as a token of my affection and respect.
You gave your girlfriend radioactive jewelry.
The emission is harmless, Doctor, but its unique signature makes it very easy to identify.
You gave your girlfriend a tracking device.
That was not my intention.
Or maybe all that Vulcan radiation gave her superpowers that let her see through Hollywood prosthetics. Terrible security. When Krall makes his move and attacks Yorktown, pretty much the only people around to help stop the baddie from unleashing his virus are Kirk and the members of his team, along with, of course, Greg Grunberg. But this is supposed to be a fully manned, top-of-the-line space station. So why are there no actual security measures? The only time we see anyone at all is when the Yorktown mall cops run right past the bad guy like a bunch of, well, mall cops. Good job! The big questions. A big chunk of Krall's plan is built on the fact that he's able to hack into Starfleet and figure out where the artifact is to stage his attack on the Enterprise. So if he can contact Starfleet, why didn't he ever just, call them for help? Isn't he like a few hundred years old? How does he even know how to pull any of this off? How is Krall able to hack into Starfleet at all? Is he a member of Anonymous? Scotty wrote the script. Now, it's important when considering some of the goofier aspects of Star Trek Beyond to remember that Simon Pegg co-wrote the script. That's probably why Scotty can suddenly scale sheer cliffs, finds a hot space elf girlfriend right out of The Hobbit, and then somehow manages to get the USS Franklin running again in a matter of hours, more than a century after it crashed face first into a planet. Knowing that Scotty is basically a walking deus ex machina also explains how he was able to teleport 20 people at a time during the film's epic escape sequence. Just a few minutes earlier, he didn't trust it enough to beam out 2 people at a time, which is why Bones nearly got nabbed by Krall's thugs.
At least I won't die alone.
Well, that's just typical.
But when the plot needs it, suddenly he's totally cool with just transporting entire football teams with no problems. Sure.
How many people can the Franklin transport at a time?
With a wee bit of modification, 20 max, but I'm not sure how long it would hold out.
Oh, and then there's the part where they jumpstart the Franklin just by flinging it off a mountain, despite the fact that we're told the Franklin wasn't designed to even function in the planet's atmosphere. Of course, it's no surprise that he struggled writing the 13th Star Trek film.
It's a fact. Sure as day follows night, sure as eggs is eggs, sure as every odd-numbered Star Trek movie is.
With a worldwide haul of $2.7 billion, Avatar is literally the most successful film ever made. And it's actually pretty good, too. Well, if the fans are to be believed anyway. Cameron's gorgeous and vibrant world was something that people just want to hang around in. And when they couldn't, they got pretty bummed out.
When I woke up this morning after watching Avatar for the first time yesterday, the world seemed gray. It was like my whole life, everything I've done and worked for, lost its meaning.
Slow down, though. That doesn't mean Avatar was perfect. Between all of those dazzling special effects were a few dumb things in Avatar that everyone just ignored. Basic biology. Let's not even get into the science of growing an alien hybrid clone and taking control of it with your emotions. But what happens to humans' bodies while they're in those pods? We're told Jake spends a 16-hour stint in that little box, but how did he, use the bathroom? Are they wearing high-tech diapers? Or are they just following Austin Powers' pod rules? We don't see anyone hooked up to anything in the box, so are they just holding it? Or is there a drain at the bottom or something? And to a larger extent, why not add a feeding tube? Hamsters do it, we can do it. Convenient straws involve science that we've already perfected for total idiots. So why can't we do this in the future? Jake loses weight and is constantly reminded to eat when he comes out of the pod. They can control alien hybrids with their mind machines, but they can't build in stuff for basic bodily functions. We expect more from you, future. Do your homework. Jake is recruited to relocate to Pandora, but he seems pretty much clueless about everything in Pandora. He skipped over the extensive training required to be part of the Avatar program and just read the manual instead.
How much lab training have you had?
I dissected a frog once.
Everyone knows you don't skip the tutorial, especially if it's your real alien body on the line. Yes, Pandora is a beautiful new world, but Jake doesn't know his Avatar ass from his Avatar elbow. He messes with plants that could be poisonous, and he doesn't know the first thing about the indigenous animals that he's tasked with protecting his team from. Which doesn't stop him from shoving his ponytail into one, which is gross. The film obviously needs a character to serve as a way into the story, but the dude could have dug a little deeper than Pandora's Wikipedia page. Why use avatars at all? The entire concept of creating these alien avatars doesn't seem like a wise way to build real trust with an alien civilization. The Na'vi are smart enough to understand that humans are different than they are, so why do they think that making these fake versions of the aliens will help them connect? Haven't they seen Star Trek? Disguising yourself as an alien rarely turns out well, and then you have to get down with a nerdy alien, and everything's a mess.
Now, will you help me?
If you make love to me,
What?
Also, if you're really trying to blend in, you have to go native. So, why the heck do they still wear human clothes on their avatar bodies? If you're going to all the trouble to build this insanely expensive alien body, you probably shouldn't dress like a tourist. Lost in Pandora. We are asked to believe that in the distant future, science can create alien avatars that can be controlled through thought, but it can't track them.
What? I got a native doing the funky chicken here. He's blocking my blade.
Well, keep going, he'll move. These people have to learn that we don't stop.
They can barely even ID their guys visually and almost killed Jake with their bulldozer. Even today, as the grunting Neanderthals that we are, we can track just about everything, from our dogs to our cars. So what's up, high-tech future? When Jake is separated from the team, they have to scour the woods to try and find him. Tracking isn't that hard, even without a global network of satellites, and especially not a century into the future. We found Waldo, we found Carmen Sandiego, and we can find Jake and his fancy alien body. Late to the game. The Na'vi have a fighting chance during the big face-off at the end of the film because Jake travels around Pandora and rallies the different tribes to help fend off the Sky People. It's too bad none of the Na'vi thought of this sooner. The entire Na'vi culture is built around a respect for nature, but this is the first time they've considered the idea of teaming up to try to push these Sky People out once and for all. All it took was a non-native hero to come in and fix all the dumb Na'vi's problems. Or maybe getting the Na'vi to do their own version of the Care Bear stare was really just a weak plot contrivance. The giant knife. It made for a cool, bizarre moment when Colonel Miles Quaritch's robot pulled out his own giant knife during a fight. But the whole thing is wildly impractical. If you want to add a bladed weapon to your giant robot, build it right into the arm. Robots are made with all kinds of awesome contraptions and hidden doodads. Instead, the robot designers created a holster for the knife, and then relied on a robo-hand to hold it, which then drops it. Even BB-8 had a lighter tucked away in his guts. And you know what? As far as movie knives go, it wasn't even all that impressive.
That's not a knife. That's a knife.
In 2017, fans of creepy clown hijinks rushed to the theater, breaking box office records in a rush to see the remake of It, adapted from the Stephen King book of the same name. The film was met with wide acclaim and hailed as a new classic. But just because something is awesome doesn't mean it can't be kinda stupid, too. Despite its iconic scenes, killer writing, and knockout performances, it has its share of moments that left us scratching our heads. Georgie who? If you know anyone who lost a sibling growing up, you're probably very aware that it's a devastating blow that can tear apart both families and communities. Except in Derry. In Derry, you mostly shrug it off and make fun of your friend's mom. When Georgie goes missing, the only people who seem torn up about it are Bill and his dad. Probably his mom, too. Her entire contribution seems to be providing incidental piano music for her youngest child to get eaten by a clown to. Everyone deals with tragedy in their own way, but none of the kids seem to do much to process the fact that a little boy straight up disappeared into the great unknown. Detective Ben. That Benjamin is a heck of a dude. He's got an eye for detail and an inquisitive mind. Would you believe he was the first person in all of Derry's history to notice that there's an inexplicable disaster every 27 years? How is it that, in a town that's been around for, presumably, about 260 years, the first person to notice this trend is a bored kid on summer break? None of the cops or teachers or historians in this town has ever been thumbing through a history of Derry and noticed that kids get killed here on an alarmingly regular basis. Congratulations, kid. You're this universe's Batman. Librarian hubris. We find Ben in the library, studying up on possible past It encounters. He's learning. That's good. We want him in the library. There's only one person who doesn't want him in the library, and that's the librarian.
Isn't it summer vacation? I would think you'd be ready to take a break from the books.
She kicks a quietly studious child out of the library. You know, like librarians do. Was there really a point in history when librarians were so secure in the idea that libraries would be around forever that they'd shoo inquisitive patrons out the door? If she's still working today, she probably looks back longingly on the days when you could evict someone from the library for something besides trying to live in the bathroom. History class. Take a look at Ben's bedroom. It's got pictures and newspaper clippings lining the walls. And, well, this. How he got all of this information home when he apparently can't leave the library without getting mugged is a mystery in itself, but that isn't the point. Who shows up in an illustration? You'd better believe it's Pennywise in a print of the signing of Derry's town charter. But it showing up in an old image means one of two things. Either it is doing his usual routine of projecting into places he shouldn't be, or else it was there at town hall in the late 1700s, and not only did nobody mention or object to it, but he just barely warranted making it into the 18th century equivalent of the group photo. How could you forget that face? Who taught you murder? As far as we know, it has one job: eating kids. That's its whole deal. It's been popping up every 27 years to do just that. So why is he so bad at it? How many kids does he kill? 2? Maybe 4, depending on how you count? The children of Derry would have been in more danger if a bad flu had hit the town. And what about the bullies that it eliminated? In a way, it saved more lives than he took by nipping those pieces of work in the bud. Pick a lane, Pennywise. There's the argument that it feeds on children's fear. 2 counterpoints. First, in a much more literal sense, he feeds on children. Secondly, in the book, it refers to causing fear as more of a way of salting the meat, which means this dude is risking his life to season his steak. Pretty fancy for a guy who spends his time in the sewers. Speaking of, diseases of Derry. Let's discuss for a moment what makes sewers so important. They convey human waste, rainwater runoff, and our ill-fated goldfish from cities to treatment plants and disposal outlets. They're more or less the key thing that separates us from apes, but they're rife with disease. And these kids are traipsing through them like they're a McDonald's play place. Sorry, every one of these kids is getting hepatitis. Eddie brings this up when they first start exploring the Barrens, but you know what sassiness doesn't protect you from? Cholera. Maybe we're projecting. The Losers Club heads to Bill's garage, where Bill has set up what's doomed to be the second worst TED Talk about clowns of all time. They're flipping through slides when the slide projector takes on a life of its own until a series of photos of Bill and Georgie's mom undergoes a nightmarish transformation. Mom straight up turns into Pennywise. And then nobody unplugs the projector.
Turn it off! Turn it off! Yeah,
Mike kicks the projector off the table, but still, nobody turns it off. Everybody in the room just screams and wigs out, failing to take their lives, or in fact the power cord, into their own hands. Ben's got guts. Tough Guy Ben walks off an astonishing number of gut injuries in this movie. First, the bullies try to carve their names into him with a switchblade, which he escapes by tumbling down a dirt hill and trouncing through sewer runoff, only to have his wounds treated by children with drugstore bandages. Then, in the creepy house, Ben gets slashed in the belly by it, which he just sort of seems to ignore afterward. After that first Haunted Mansion encounter, he's just standing out in the street with 4-foot-long gashes in his abdomen. You could maybe see his appendix if you squint. It's worth pointing out that during that whole scene, Eddie's mom is standing in front of Ben, watching him bleed from his torso, and she thinks it's more important to shame a 12-year-old than it is to find him a doctor. The adults in this town are a mess. Defying death. In a lot of ways, it isn't supposed to make sense. It's a piece of horror fiction that deals in the supernatural. But still, there's one thing that really, truly doesn't make any sense. Specifically, how are those insanely self-destructive bullies still alive? All we see them do in this movie is take needless risks for 2 hours. They drive blindly down alleyways at breakneck speed. They make flamethrowers out of cans of hairspray. They dive headfirst down steep hills covered in debris. They play with loaded guns. They're the definition of awful. It shouldn't have taken an extra-dimensional demon to beat these jerks. With their behavior, every one of them should have been a full-color in loving memory page in the yearbook by their sophomore year.
The Terminator has spawned multiple sequels and prequels, both in movie theaters and on television, but as good as it is, it's far from a perfect film. To learn how, among other things, a perfectly logical thinking machine acts like a moron, keep watching for the dumb things everyone ignored in The Terminator. Since he's governed by a ruthlessly calculating artificial intelligence, you might assume that the Terminator would make purely logical choices. Watch the movie though, and one of the first things you'll notice is that his actions absolutely do not reflect that. For one thing, he can't even decide on how quiet he needs to keep his time travel murder mission. As soon as he arrives in the 80s, for example, the Terminator makes an immediate effort to get era-appropriate clothing that will allow him to blend into 1984. Or at least blend in as much as an insanely jacked Austrian bodybuilder can, anyway.
Hey, I think this guy's a couple cans short of a six-pack.
Your clothes. Give them to me, now.
And yet, throughout the movie, he draws plenty of attention to himself and never seems to care. He steals a pile of guns from a gun shop and murders the owner with a shotgun. This is the loudest possible way he could do it, which will almost certainly draw the attention of the police. Even in what we see in the movie up to that point, it's obvious that he could totally kill the owner with his bare hands, flip the closed sign over, and lock the door behind him, giving him at least a few hours before anyone thinks to call the authorities. Shortly afterward, he kills the first Sarah Connor he finds in the phone book. He bothers to knock on the door and ask her name, then smashes the door open and shoots her 6 times in a quiet residential neighborhood. As with the gun shop, he could have done it all much more quietly. And if he's not going to be quiet, why bother knocking on the door and asking her name? Manners? Every now and then, you come across a character in a movie who is so annoying and stupid that you can't help but despise them as a viewer, while the comparatively intelligent protagonist doesn't seem to thoroughly hate them as much as they should. Such is the case of Nancy, the waitress who ranks among the most frustrating characters in the history of film. Sarah Connor is working at a diner when we meet her, and not only is her section filled with increasingly irate customers, a young boy takes the opportunity to drop a lump of ice cream in her apron. That's when Nancy comes up behind her and says that nobody's going to care in 100 years, which is the kind of contrived zinger that she would only say if she knew she was in a movie where time-traveling robots exterminated human civilization in the next century. Then she just bails without even bothering to help her friend and coworker clean up the mess. That might not seem that bad, but don't worry, Nancy goes completely off the rails a few minutes later. After the Terminator kills another woman named Sarah Connor and makes the news, Nancy grabs Sarah and pulls her into the break room to watch the report, giving her the most insane reason ever spoken.
You're not going to believe this. Sit down, you are going to love this!
Why would anyone love hearing about how someone with their name was violently murdered? What's wrong with you, Nancy? She's just lucky she didn't say this stuff to the super buff T2 Sarah Connor, who would have absolutely punched her lights out. From what Kyle Reese says, he didn't have a lot of time to prepare for his trip into the past. After he's arrested, Reese tells the police psychologist that John Connor's forces found a time machine in a lab complex they captured. Reese was sent to the 20th century and the lab complex was destroyed. Even if they were hustling to get to the past though, which seems like a weird concern when you have a time machine, shouldn't John Connor have taken a couple of minutes to remind Reese that it was probably going to be tough to protect his mom if she thought he was completely insane? The first conversation the two characters have after Reese storms into a nightclub blasting at a gun-toting assailant, which to put it mildly is a pretty stressful situation, involves Reese overloading Sarah with a flood of ridiculously precise information about the Terminator. It's like he's reading the instruction manual, going on about its microprocessor-controlled hyperalloy combat chassis. That's not information that Sarah would care about or even understand in the best of times, let alone when it's being shouted at her by a sweaty man with a shotgun. Her initial reaction? Once Reese pulls into a parking garage, Sarah understandably tries to escape, biting Reese's hand hard enough to draw blood. Can you blame her? Reese is from a bleak, apocalyptic future filled with killer robots, so the world of 1984 is probably as weird to him as he is to Sarah. But someone definitely should have given him some tips on how to start up a conversation with another human being. And even if they didn't, Reese is a smart guy. Starting off slow and then easing Sarah Connor into the world of the hyperalloy combat chassis would seem like a pretty obvious strategy. As you may already know, the Terminator is pretty difficult to destroy.
It doesn't feel pity, or remorse, or fear, and it absolutely will not stop. Ever!
For the most part, the best Kyle Reese can do is slow the Terminator down, but as the film progresses, the cyborg shows more and more signs of battle damage. Eventually, he's completely stripped of all flesh, revealing his mechanical interior. The first casualties of the Terminator's outward human disguise are his eyebrows, which are burned off in an explosion after he attacks Sarah and Reese in a nightclub. It makes sense that he'd lose them too, since they'd naturally be singed off with that kind of fire. What doesn't make sense is that the eyebrows are all the Terminator loses in that fight. The same exploding gas tank that engulfs his entire body and completely erases his eyebrows has done absolutely nothing to the hair on his head, nor do his clothes seem at all damaged by the flames. You could maybe write off the clothes by assuming that the punk the Terminator stole his outfit from invested in a fireproof wardrobe for some unexplained reason. But for the hair, there's no excuse. Even stranger, the scene happens right before Reese has a conversation with Sarah where he explicitly tells her that this model of Terminator has fully organic skin and hair covering up its metal skeleton. If those eyebrows are going, Arnold's perfect coif should be dust too. After showing up in 1984 and eventually finding a pair of pants, Reese tries to explain the future to Sarah as best he can. He covers the emergence of Skynet and the resulting nuclear holocaust, the rise of the Terminators, and their grim plans for humanity. He explains it all, but the audience is left with a mystery. How does Reese, or John Connor, or anyone else in the future even know about Skynet, or how their world came under the literal iron fist of the machines? Obviously, the survivors would know that the machines were in charge, but when you think about it, it isn't quite so obvious to figure out how the human resistance ever learned about the creation of Skynet. From what Reese tells us, Skynet decided the fate of the human race in a millisecond. All of that presumably took place within the AI's processors. With the human race left scattered and without access to technology or the power to make that technology work, how could anyone be able to access the data necessary to determine how the world went sideways? They don't necessarily need to know in order to fight back, but they certainly need a way to discover it if they're going to go back in time and explain it to Sarah Connor. The big twist of the Terminator is, of course, that it's all one big loop. After traveling back in time at the request of John Connor, Reese and Sarah get it on, and in the process, they conceive that same John Connor, humanity's savior, who wouldn't exist if it wasn't for the mission that he ordered. That's destiny, baby. Even if you can get your head around all the time travel hijinks, though, the fact that their brief affair even happens is just a little weird, if not majorly weird. While they're on the run from the Terminator, Reese ends up confessing to Sarah that her unborn son gave him a picture of her, which he kept and obsessed over for years. He tells her that he fell in love with her because of that photo, without ever meeting her or talking to her. It's more than just a little creepy. Sarah is obviously still reeling from being hunted by a killer cyborg from the future, not to mention being on the run from the authorities and having her roommate murdered. And yet, even with all that, learning that this sweaty weirdo became obsessed with her thanks to a photograph that she hasn't even taken yet is the weirdest thing that's happened to her. Why doesn't she freak out even more? Or maybe she's into it. We're not judging. It just seems like most first dates that start off with "I'm from the future" are already going to be in enough jeopardy without adding "and I used to just stare at your picture for hours on end." When he's first being interviewed by the condescending police psychologist, Reese says that things in the future are actually starting to look up for the few remaining humans. Under the leadership of John Connor, they had won the battle against Skynet and smashed the machine's defense grid. Sending the Terminator back in time was a last-ditch effort on the machine's part, made out of desperation.
Why this elaborate scheme with the Terminator?
It had no choice. Their defense grid was smashed. We'd won.
That's good news for humanity, but from what little we see of the future, it's kind of hard to believe. In both scenes we see of the future, first with Reese and his fellow soldiers being defeated by a flying machine, and then with the Terminator infiltrating an underground bunker and killing almost everyone in sight, the humans seem absolutely hopeless. Maybe that's just how things are on the front, but all of those piles of skulls aren't exactly cheery, especially since Reese has to throw everything he can at the Terminator to barely slow it down, and eventually dies in the process. So how exactly does John Connor manage to defeat this unstoppable, self-replicating enemy? The humans have barely any resources, and we see them hunt rats for food. The fact that they have any weaponry at all seems like at least a minor miracle. It's hard to understand how they could possibly win, no matter how good John is at looking through binoculars. The Terminator ends with Sarah Connor in Mexico on her way to becoming the hardened badass we find in 1991's Terminator 2 Judgment Day. She's got a new dog with her, presumably to detect any other Terminators who might travel through time, and she's recording a sort of journal on tape as she travels, musing on the question of whether or not she will tell her unborn son that Kyle Reese was his father. Of all the things she could be telling anyone about the future, is the identity of John's father really her biggest concern? A time-traveling paternity test might make a great episode for Maury Povich once his show starts up in 1991. Come on, Sarah, let's get our priorities straight here. Of course, that's not to suggest Sarah should be yelling from the highest mountain that everyone's going to die soon thanks to killer robots. As we see in Terminator 2, that's exactly the sort of thing that lands her in a mental institution. It's just that in terms of what she should reveal about the future, she's rating, "Do I tell my son about his dad?" over, "Do I tell people they should start building robot-proof shelters?"
Yes, Indiana Jones is among the most beloved of film franchises, but that doesn't mean the movies are without their flaws. We've all rolled our eyes at the scene where Indy survives a nuclear bomb by hiding in a refrigerator, but here's a rundown of some other less obvious but still pretty dumb things that the Indiana Jones movies ask its viewers to ignore. When Raiders of the Lost Ark opens, Indiana Jones is unfazed by his colleagues' stories about ancient mystical powers that could destroy everyone seeking the Ark of the Covenant. By the end of the movie, once he's experienced a bunch of ghosts with the power to melt Nazis' faces off, he's forced to accept that there are powers in the world well beyond his understanding. He even ends the movie by warning the government agents that they don't know what they're dealing with.
You don't look very happy.
Fools. Bureaucratic
What'd
fools.
they say?
They don't know what they've got there.
Great character arc, right? Here's a problem. While it came out 3 years after Raiders, Temple of Doom is actually a prequel that takes place a year earlier. In that movie, Indy saw a man's heart magically ripped from his chest while still beating, and personally turned magic stones white hot by invoking the name of Shiva. Despite bearing witness to all that, Indiana Jones is still a skeptic. In The Last Crusade, he's very quick to dismiss stories about King Arthur and the Holy Grail as bedtime stories. He's even still hanging on to those doubts when Crystal Skull rolls around. It's one thing to try and ensure your character can be relatable and realistic when he's dealing with ancient fantastical mysteries, but for Indy to simply ignore some of the most exciting, perplexing, and incredibly real moments of his life is just silly. After thrilling chases, a couple of failed rescue attempts, and outsmarting the bad guys at every turn throughout Raiders of the Lost Ark, Indiana Jones and Marion Ravenwood are captured and forced to witness a hellish moment when the bad guys open the Ark. As the power of the Ark is unleashed, Indy tells Marion that they can't look at it, no matter what happens. He's right too. In the midst of a cadre of Nazis being burned alive by the wrath of God, the good guys are spared from its wrath. So how in the world did Indy know not to look at the Ark? Earlier in the film, it's mentioned that the Ark was hidden away due to its immense power being too much for mankind to handle. But the cheat code of just closing one's eyes came kind of out of nowhere. Also, we're not complaining, but it does seem a little weird that nobody else figured out that they shouldn't look at the blinding light that was melting everyone. As it turns out, Indy was warned about this in a scene that was cut from the final version of the movie. That might be a good way for Indy to know, but the audience sure doesn't. It might seem like we're picking on Raiders, but in a movie that's otherwise perfect, the few flaws are really easy to spot. Take for instance, Indy's trip on a Nazi submarine. The key word there is on, not in. With the help of a friendly sea captain, Indy stealths his way into a U-boat to rescue Marion and defeat Belloc, jumping atop it just before it goes underwater. The film then cuts to an island where the villains plan to open the Ark of the Covenant. So how did our soaking wet Indy survive the trip? Obviously, he couldn't just cling to the periscope and hold his breath for hundreds of miles. But from what we've seen in the movie, and even a deleted scene, that's exactly what happened. It's just a good thing nobody ever bothered to lower the periscope for the entire trip, or else would have to deal with the explanation that Indy was secretly the lost king of Atlantis all this time. When Temple of Doom opens, Indiana Jones is accompanied by a young child named Wan Li, who Jones refers to as Short Round. It's later revealed that the young Chinese boy from Shanghai got busted trying to pick the archaeologist's pocket, and they eventually became friends.
You make me poor. No fun.
While opinions are split about Short Round, it's undeniable that he provided some comic relief and drove the getaway car, pulled stunts as daring as his mentor, and even broke Indy from a magic mind-control trance. By the end of the film, they both return to the small Indian village as triumphant heroes. After that, who knows? The third movie opens with absolutely no mention of Short Round. There's not even a whisper of him, nor is he mentioned in Raiders of the Lost Ark, which came after Temple of Doom chronologically. Short Round is just gone after the credits roll. Romantic partners like Willie come and go for a rugged and handsome bachelor like Jones. The young child that he took under his wing and brought thousands of miles from his home on numerous death-defying adventures, you'd think they'd at least stay in touch. We might even be willing to forgive some of Crystal Skull's more egregious sins if Indy's successor turns out to be Ke Huy Quan instead of Shia LaBeouf. There's a lot to be upset about in Kingdom of the Crystal Skull, but the most important might just be that it shifts the genre of the franchise in a way that just doesn't work. There's nothing wrong with a good science fiction story, if that's what you want to call this movie. But for it to come in the fourth installment of a franchise rooted in pulpy, fantastical adventure after a nearly 20-year gap just feels jarring and unnecessary.
I've got a bad feeling about this.
The movie ends with Jones and his cohorts finding a collection of alien skeletons with one missing head. After returning the infamous Crystal Skull, the aliens come to life and vacate Earth in a flying saucer. Indiana Jones is a guy who frequently comes across the unknown in his pursuits of ancient and mysterious artifacts, but Roswell aliens are a very different kind of mysterious, even if, and especially if, they show up 20 years after he was dealing with biblical goblets. They feel out of place in Indy's world of historical legends and supernatural treasures. In short, never switch your genre in the fourth movie of a series.
Life moves pretty fast. If you don't stop and look around once in a while, you could miss it.
Well, Ferris Bueller's Day Off moves pretty fast too. Perhaps everyone has seen it so many times that they didn't even stop and look around and realize that there are a lot of baffling events in the movie. One of Ferris's earliest schemes involves securing a car for the day. Ferris tells us,
I asked for a car, I got a computer.
as a way of explaining why he doesn't have wheels of his own. The problem is that his computer is one of the many expensive toys that fill his bedroom. In addition to a computer, cool enough to be connected to the web in the mid-80s, Ferris's room is also stuffed with a slick sound system and even a synthesizer he puts to particularly good use. Throw in a classic electric guitar and he's got quite a bit of money laying around. Sell your stuff, Bueller. After fooling his parents with a fake illness, Ferris's next big task is convincing his best friend Cameron Fry to join him on his day off. Ironically, Cameron is already out of school for the day, homesick in bed for real. Ferris doesn't believe Cameron, noting his hypochondriac tendencies, but Cameron does seem to be quite ill, so much so that he barely feels like moving. Somehow, Ferris is able to rouse him and bring him along on the trip, and just like that, Cameron is fine. He goes from lying in bed to hanging out at a Chicago Cubs game. Not once during the day do we see Cameron becoming dizzy, trying to nap, or knocking back some Dayquil. He was either faking it or he was miraculously cured. Ferris invites Cameron along, in part because he needs a car. They could just use Cameron's, but Ferris is too greedy for that. He wants to spend the day out on the town in style, and has his heart set on stealing Cameron's father's car, a limited edition 1961 Ferrari convertible. It's a pretty sweet ride, and so valuable that Cameron's dad doesn't even drive it.
He just rubs it with a diaper.
Despite the car's value though, there's little to no security for it. It's just sitting there, without any protection, in the garage, which Cameron and Ferris can just walk into. It's almost as if Mr. Fry wants it to get stolen. Ferris covers his tracks at his house with a dummy, a complex pulley system, and a tape playing snoring sounds. By comparison, his scheme to get his girlfriend Sloane Peterson out of school for the day is surprisingly low-tech. It starts with a phone call from Cameron, posing as Sloane's father, claiming her grandmother died. Ferris and Cameron then head to the school to grab Sloane. When Ferris arrives, he has to disguise himself as her father by wearing an oversized trench coat and old-fashioned hat. Somehow, Dean of Students Mr. Rooney is fooled by the lazy ruse, even after Ferris and Sloane share a long, wet kiss. One of the first things Ferris does on his day off is take Cameron and Sloane to an extremely fancy restaurant. He doesn't have a reservation, so he steals someone else's from the restaurant's list. For this scheme, he chooses to pose as Abe Froman,
The Sausage King of Chicago.
The restaurant's host is of course very skeptical of Ferris's claim. Ferris works around him by having Sloane call the restaurant and describe him as Froman. Somehow, it works, and the baby-faced teen who is obviously not a meat magnate gets his table. One of the most famous scenes in Ferris Bueller's Day Off is the parade sequence, but there's a lot about the scene that's hard to understand. It's a big cultural event that shuts down several downtown city blocks, but it's somehow held in the middle of a weekday. The heart of the scene is a bit baffling too. Huge parades are highly secured, but this one just lets some random teen up onto a float to lip sync to an old Wayne Newton song. And why does the float have a microphone anyway? It's not hooked up to any kind of sound system. This all leads to a synchronized dance number set to Twist and Shout. It's a little more realistic that Ferris would know that song, but it's not realistic at all that a bunch of people have put together dance routines to go along with this otherwise completely spontaneous performance. Ferris plans his day off so it's packed with extremely fun activities. He and his friends go to the Sears Tower, the Art Institute of Chicago, a fancy lunch, a Chicago Cubs game, and even a parade. One problem with packing all that into one day is that there's no way Ferris, Cameron, and Sloane could fit it all in with the limited time they've got. It's mid-morning by the time Ferris convinces Cameron to come with him. Then he has to jailbreak Sloane from school and then drive into the city. Once they're in the city, they have to leave the car in a garage. Factoring in travel time between activities, plus setbacks like traffic, there's no way Ferris is getting back to the suburbs before his parents. The villain of the film is Dean of Students Ed Rooney, and he both hates and obsesses over Ferris Bueller. The thing is that Rooney actually has a good reason, noting that Ferris...
He gives good kids bad ideas.
It's Rooney's job to keep the student body in line and in class, something Ferris doesn't help with. He has so many absences that it's a problem. Rooney knows this, and even sees the evidence of Ferris covering his tracks by hacking school records. So Rooney spends the movie tracking Bueller to prove the kid isn't really sick. He goes through a lot of nonsense to catch Bueller in the act of skipping school, which means he's really just a guy trying to do his job.
Stanley Kubrick's The Shining is a masterpiece. As a result, some details in the film that seem out of place serve to illustrate the supernatural forces at work in the Overlook. Other inconsistencies can't be dismissed so easily. Here are a few dumb things in The Shining that we just can't ignore. The creepy sets and confusing layout of the Overlook Hotel are a central part of the plot of The Shining. The halls are a labyrinth, and the feeling of being lost and isolated with no idea what's around the next corner is a key part of what makes everything so scary. This mysterious feeling is mirrored by the hedge maze outside, and while it's only fitting that the climax of the film takes place there, the location is established very early on, just not as early as it should have been. The opening scene of the film gives the audience an aerial view of the overlook and the grounds, including the hotel itself, the surrounding forests, and the mountains in the distance. The feeling of isolation is there, reinforcing the idea that this is the kind of place where no one can hear you scream for help. Eagle-eyed viewers will notice that there's something missing though. The hedge maze is supposed to be right next to the hotel, just a short walk away from the entrance, but in the shot that establishes our setting, it's nowhere to be found, despite the fact that it's enormous and would definitely be visible from the sky. Maybe it just sprung up as a product of Jack's increasing madness, or maybe the curse at the heart of the Overlook just really likes metaphors. Before officially accepting the caretaker job, Jack goes back to the Overlook for an interview. At first, it's pretty standard, with Mr. Ullman, the manager, telling him all about the job and his potential responsibilities. He warns him about just how far away from civilization he'll really be, explaining there's basically nothing to do outside of the hotel, and that he and his family will be alone. He then drops what might be the biggest red flag that any job interview has ever had while discussing how the previous caretaker lost the job.
Killed his family with an axe.
Ullman also mentions in passing that although they're in Colorado, there's no skiing in the area. Clearly, this is just to reinforce the idea that there's no quick way off the mountain, but it's contradicted by the film itself. It's tough to spot, but in those aerial shots at the beginning of the film, you can see a ski lift going up the side of a mountain not far from the hotel. Before the events of the film take place, Jack Torrance came home drunk one night and dislocated Danny's shoulder. He then promised that he wouldn't touch alcohol ever again. Wendy tells Danny's doctor about the incident, saying that it's been 5 months since Danny's injury, and so far, Jack has stayed true to his word. Perhaps unsurprisingly, however, Jack later makes a comment that doesn't match up with Wendy's timeline.
I did hurt him once, okay?
When he's sitting at the bar in the Gold Room and griping to the bartender Lloyd about what happened, he says that it all went down 3 years ago. There are a couple of possible explanations for this. The most obvious is that it's just a minor mistake in the script, which makes sense given how many drafts The Shining went through before it was filmed. With Kubrick behind the camera though, there's also a chance that this was totally intentional. Maybe Jack is disconnecting from time as the isolation of the Overlook drives him mad. Maybe he's remembering an incident from Grady's life, not his own. Or maybe, in the most disturbing possibility, that incident a few months ago wasn't the only time that Jack hurt Danny, and he doesn't even remember the more recent abuse. When Jack visits the Gold Room and meets Lloyd the bartender, we're not sure if Lloyd is a ghost or a projection of Jack's twisted mind. Regardless, Jack strikes up a conversation with him and orders himself a bourbon on the rocks. He drinks throughout his rant about how Wendy won't forgive him for his abuse of Danny, and when Wendy actually arrives in the Gold Room crying about a mysterious woman who tried to strangle Danny, Lloyd suddenly disappears, along with all of the liquor and decor behind the bar. It's a genuinely unsettling scene, but either someone in the props department got a little mixed up, or Lloyd isn't actually the best bartender from Timbuktu to Portland, Maine, or Portland, Oregon. Instead of the bourbon he asked for, Lloyd pours Jack a drink from a bottle of Jack Daniel's Old No. 7, which isn't quite what he asked for. While Jack Daniel's is legally classified as straight bourbon, the distillery never markets it or refers to it as anything but whiskey. Lloyd's technically correct, but a hard drinker like Jack Torrance would definitely know the difference between a Tennessee whiskey and a Kentucky bourbon, even in Colorado. As the Torrance family drives to the Overlook, we see that they're traveling in a small yellow Volkswagen Beetle. The shots from inside the car revealed that while it's fairly cramped space, there is at least enough room for Danny to move around. Later, in the lobby of the Overlook, however, Jack gestures to the family's huge pile of luggage sitting by the door. Jack, Wendy, and Danny are staying at the Overlook for months, and there won't be anywhere for them to go shopping, so they definitely need all their clothes. If they were really making that journey in a VW Beetle, though, there's no way they could have crammed their entire wardrobe in the car and still had room to breathe.
Even with the creepy, space-bending geography of the Overlook, there's only so much that a Volkswagen can hold, unless they also bought their car from an ancient, cursed burial ground.
Though Halloween is renowned among horror hounds, the film is not without its flaws, oddities, and strange leaps of logic. None of these examples can diminish the film's overall legacy, but let's not pretend there aren't some dumb things everyone ignores about John Carpenter's Halloween. Major horror films of the 1970s like Carrie and Last House on the Left tended to cast 20-somethings in the roles of teens. In this respect, Halloween is no different, but that doesn't make the casting any less distracting. With the exception of Jamie Lee Curtis, who was 19 at the time Halloween was released, the actors who played the teenagers were all well into their 20s. PJ Soles, the actress who plays Laurie's cheerleader friend Linda, was 28 years old. Similarly, Laurie's other friend Annie was portrayed by 29-year-old Nancy Kyes. When all three girls are together on screen, it's incredibly awkward to watch two grown women pretend to be high school girls. When paired with Curtis, who is noticeably younger than the other two actresses, the glaring age differences are impossible to ignore.
I forgot my chemistry book.
So who cares? I always forget my chemistry book and my math book and my English book.
After Michael breaks out of Smith's Grove Sanitarium at the beginning of the film, Dr. Loomis rightfully fears what Michael will do with his newfound freedom. He takes his concern to the police but is promptly brushed off, leaving him to hunt Michael on his own.
Well, he was your patient, Doctor. If precautions weren't strong enough, you should have told somebody.
I told everybody!
Suspecting Michael will return to his childhood home, Loomis makes his way to Haddonfield. On his way, he stops at a payphone and by pure circumstance, stumbles onto an abandoned car. While the camera pans to show the audience the driver's body lying nearby, Loomis is not privy to the murder. Nevertheless, the good doctor somehow surmises that the abandoned car and a stray matchbook are solid proof that Michael Myers was there. What's so bizarre about this scene isn't just the unlikely circumstances or Loomis's apparent sixth sense, but the fact that he doesn't appear to report the crime at all. If Loomis is genuinely concerned about what he found, why wouldn't he call the police? If he had taken even a minute to look around and not run off after finding a random matchbook on the ground, he would have seen the dead body, and it would have likely forced the police to cooperate. While we don't know much about the specific events that triggered Loomis's immense fear of Michael, it's safe to say the Doctor knows far more about the killer's violent tendencies than anyone else. After breaking out of confinement, stealing a car, assaulting a woman, and killing an innocent man, you'd think anyone hunting Michael would at least be cautious. Surprisingly, the hunt for Michael is incredibly low-key. Loomis seeks out the help of Haddonfield Sheriff Lee Brackett, and the two hunt Michael alone. At some point, the sheriff suggests a full-blown manhunt, but Loomis tosses the idea aside for fear of causing a panic.
If you do that, they'll see him on every street corner. They'll look for him in every house. Just tell your men to keep their mouths shut and their eyes open.
Meanwhile, Michael is walking around, killing teenagers and terrorizing Laurie. It seems hypocritical from Loomis of all people to prefer discretion over action. At the beginning of the film, he was desperately seeking police help, but when he finally gets it, he turns the offer down. If a full search was organized, maybe Laurie's friends wouldn't have been butchered. When Annie and Laurie stumble onto a recently robbed hardware store, Annie's father tells them that someone has stolen a Halloween mask, some knives, and rope. The robbery must have just happened, as the alarm is blaring in the background, and a group of police officers are actively surveying the scene.
What happened?
Oh, somebody broke into the hardware store, probably kids.
Given the context, the film is hinting that Michael is the one who stole the mask and the murder tools. In theory, that makes sense. But given the fact that the girls had already encountered a masked Michael far before the robbery supposedly occurred, he couldn't have stolen the mask. The first time we see Michael after he escapes from Smith's Grove is when he waits outside of Laurie's school, clearly already wearing the mask. Hours later, when Laurie walks home with her friends, the group encounters Michael twice, and right before Laurie goes out with Annie, she spots him again outside of her window. All of these occurrences happen before Michael supposedly robs the store, and yet in all of them, he's wearing the mask. Unless he robbed another store and took another identical mask for good measure, this timeline just doesn't add up. Though it's understandable that Laurie would make some mistakes in a life or death situation, it's less acceptable that she would make the same mistake 3 times. When Michael surprises Laurie from inside the Doyle house, she reflexively stabs the killer with a knitting needle. Michael falls to the ground, seemingly defeated. In typical horror fashion, however, he is very much alive and pursues Laurie again shortly after. Again, Laurie attacks Michael, jabbing him in the eye with a coat hanger and stabbing him with a knife. Michael is down once more, but instead of checking to see if he's done for good, Laurie makes the same mistake as before and just assumes he's dead. Not ready to call it quits, Michael gets right back up. This time, Loomis takes the offensive and shoots him, causing Michael to fall off of the balcony. Despite Laurie failing to kill Michael twice before, she and Loomis decide it's better to have a conversation, rather than check to make sure the fall or the gunshots successfully killed Michael.
What's the boogeyman? As a matter of fact, it was.
By the time anyone bothers to look, he's long gone. If Loomis or Laurie had cared enough to check Michael's pulse, they wouldn't have to worry about him continuing his killing spree. Then again, how else would he have had so many Halloween sequels? Being a low-budget independent film created in a short period, Halloween naturally couldn't avoid its fair share of little mistakes, ranging from continuity errors to production goofs that eagle-eyed viewers may be able to catch. For example, a crew member is reflected in the phone booth glass right before Loomis discovers the driver Michael killed on his way to Haddonfield. Though it can be a bit hard to notice, you can see Linda stumble as she and Bob head upstairs in the Wallace house. Apparently, PJ Souls didn't just lose her footing. The actress tripped over a dolly truck. And when Annie is teasing Laurie about Michael in front of the hedges, a puff of smoke is briefly caught on camera. According to John Carpenter, the smoke came from his own cigarette.
Did you even know that Kate Winslet was in Avatar: The Way of Water? Did Quaritch and Spider's relationship feel forced? Here's the dumbest things that happened in the Avatar sequel. Avatar: The Way of Water is stuck in a strange limbo. It's both a sequel, picking up where Avatar left off in a literal sense, but also clearly made with a nostalgic zeal to remind people of the original. Think of the way the Jurassic World movies feel more like Jurassic Park theme park rides than actual extensions of a coherent story. The dumbest thing in The Way of Water that we just have to live with is how it shoehorns new roles for Sigourney Weaver and Stephen Lang into the story, even though both of their characters died in the first movie. Weaver's new character, Kiri, a child mysteriously born of the avatar of her original character, Dr. Grace Augustine, at least has some strange messianic qualities that are unique. But asking us to just roll with Lang's psychotic Colonel Quaritch being reborn as a recombinant form of Avatar is a bit much. It retcons Avatar in the sense that the technology to create a digital copy of a human consciousness apparently existed at the time, and Quaritch and his team backed themselves up before the final showdown. So essentially, like the ill-fated ending of Lost, The Way of Water is asking us to invest in a world where death has no meaning. Were Grace Augustine and the other scientists also backed up? That would certainly explain why her avatar is just hanging around in a tank, for no discernible purpose. The biggest criticism of the first Avatar is that Jake Sully is a classic white savior. It's tone deaf that way that a complete stranger to the Na'vi way of life ends up uniting the tribes and being chosen as Turok Makto. You'd think years later in The Way of Water, since Jake is integrated more fully and had half Na'vi children with Neytiri, that this would be less of a prevalent theme. But it seems Kiri has been added to the story as a second white savior for the price of one. Though raised as Na'vi, she's essentially a sort of reincarnated version of Grace Augustine, the other most benevolent white person from the first movie. Kiri clearly has some Chosen One type powers brewing, as she commutes with nature and can hear the heartbeat of Awa, the All-Mother. Not to mention, The Way of Water goes the same route to Star Wars: The Phantom Menace, in introducing the idea of immaculate conception with a couple of casual offhand remarks. It's apparently a total mystery how Grace Augustine's comatose avatar gave birth to a child, although the movie pulls at a very disturbing thread a couple of times, as Kiri and other characters wonder who her father might be.
There is something really interesting going on in there biologically. I would die to get samples.
Few sins of the original Avatar are as unforgivable as unobtainium, the precious mineral that humans were on Pandora to harvest. Fortunately, no one utters that ridiculous word in The Way of Water. Although the reappearance of humanity is abruptly handled, we do learn early on that they have a much more straightforward and urgent reason to return to Pandora than getting rich. That is, Earth is dying, and Pandora is to be entirely colonized as humanity's new home. This creates a compelling global threat to all of the Na'vi clans that's not even based on a bad pun. But fully 2/3 of the way through The Way of Water, we learn there's an entirely brand new magical substance that humanity is after on Pandora. It's a serum harvested from the brains of giant sentient whale-like creatures called Tolkien. This enzyme called Amrite apparently stops the aging process entirely in humans. So the hunting of Tolkiens becomes another lazy, obvious allegory for the awful colonizers not to respect sacred Na'vi traditions. since the Metkayina bond with the Tolkien and are heartbroken at their loss. The humans, of course, harvest just about a 2-liter soda bottle's worth of amrite from a Tolkien the size of a battleship and leave the rest to rot. Were you even aware that the great Kate Winslet is in this movie? She provides the voice of Ronal, the wife of the Metkayina's leader, and mostly glares disapprovingly at Jake and family for endangering her tribe. The Way of Water introduces many new characters, but not a single one has the star power of Winslet, an Oscar winner and one of the greatest actresses of her generation. So it's a bit dumb when you realize that, like the majority of characters in this overstuffed movie, she didn't have time for any sort of character arc or subplot of her own. While it's likely she has a bigger role to play in future installments, it doesn't make her bit part in The Way of Water any less of a missed opportunity. Other than mourning her soul sister Tolkien's death and being very justifiably angry at the Sullys for bringing destruction with them out to the islands, Ronal barely registers. This is why Kate Winslet had to hold her breath underwater for more than 7 minutes.
Yes, that's true.
Probably the most preposterous running thread in Avatar: The Way of Water is the relationship between the recombinant Colonel Quaritch and his long-lost son, Spider. The kid is the most prominent fully human character left in the story, having been left on Pandora as a small child and raised with the Na'vi. The Way of Water wants us to buy into big plot points pivoting on the burgeoning emotional bonds between this child of two worlds and the lab-grown avatar of his deceased father. The problem with this is that Quaritch, in either human or avatar form, is by far the most one-dimensional character in either movie. He's nothing but a murderous soldier, and he outright tells Spider that since he's technically a form of clone, he's not actually his father anyway. Sure, Quaritch and Spider may have a few bonding moments while the latter was being held hostage, but it really didn't go far enough. Then, seemingly out of nowhere, Quaritch is suddenly concerned about Spider when Neytiri threatens his life in late standoff. Spider then saves Quaritch's life, which doesn't feel earned at all. It also doesn't even really matter, because presumably the humans could just keep growing new Quaritch recombinant and re-downloading his consciousness anyway. James Cameron has an incredibly successful career, so perhaps he's earned a little bit of self-referential leeway. But we have to bring into question the sequence near the end of The Way of Water, where star-crossed crushes Lo'ak and Rhea attempt to survive by clambering around the outside of an overturned ship. These moments are pretty shamelessly close to the beats from Cameron's Titanic, to the point that it takes you out of the movie a little bit. It's already a bit much to ask us to just roll with their romance, which lazily recreates the same beats as Jake and Neytiri's story in the first movie. Just like his father, Lo'ak is a stranger to the Metkayina clan, but learns their ways and charms the chief's daughter. He also befriends a dangerous and sacred animal that they revere, and is told "I see you" by Rhea in a direct echo.
Alien, that's all they see.
I see you.
During the sequence when a whaling vessel slowly turns upside down, Lo'ak and Rhea end up precariously perched right on top of it as it submerges in the water. Just like Jack and Rose in Titanic, they promise to hold on to each other when they take the plunge. What's James Cameron up to? One of the strangest scenes in Avatar: The Way of Water is when Norm and Max fly out to the islands to try and see what's going on with Kiri, who had a seizure while connected to the Metkayina version of the Spirit Tree. Attaching diodes and machines to Kiri's head, Norm speculates that her spiritual connection to Eywa may be a side effect of epilepsy. It's an abrupt and strange suggestion after lots of evidence that there may be nothing special about Kiri at all. This flies in the face of the genuinely faith-forward nature of both Avatar movies and never gets followed up on. In general, the spiritual purity of the Na'vi and the real-world influence of Eywa is empirically obvious. In the first movie, the Na'vi basically are losing the fight until Eywa intervenes and possesses all the animal life on the planet to attack the human forces. Avatar as a franchise seems to have no interest in sincerely exploring the delicate balance between science and faith. This scene, which dabbles in skepticism just for the sake of a distraction, is one of the dumbest things in The Way of Water. Most people don't go to the movies to read, so subtitles can often be a deal-breaker when you're browsing the Netflix menu. As Jake Sully learned the ways of the Omaticaya clan of the Na'vi in the first Avatar, the movie was committed to showing both English and Na'vi being spoken consistently, and subtitling the alien dialogue whenever necessary. The way language was treated was logical and consistent. But in The Way of Water, director James Cameron and company must have realized early on that since Jake has now been living with the Na'vi for more than a decade, they would essentially be making a foreign language film. To solve this, very early in the sequel, Jake tells us via voiceover that he's learned the Na'vi language so thoroughly that when he hears it, it may as well be English. And presto, suddenly we also hear his children and all other Na'vi speaking English. When Na'vi interact with other English-speaking characters later, they're still subtitled. But whenever Na'vi are talking to each other, it's all English for convenience's sake. It does save the audience a lot of subtitle reading. But it's a bracingly dumb and inelegant tweak to the rules of the way the reality of what we're seeing it being depicted. After the earnest pride that the first Avatar took in realizing Na'vi culture, it's kind of surprising that The Way of Water just shrugs and transforms 90% of potentially Na'vi dialogue into plain old English.